You are standing on a windswept dock in the Tyrrhenian Sea on a grey December morning in 26 AD, watching as a small fishing boat disappears into the mist toward a jagged island on the horizon. The fisherman who brought you this far refuses to go any closer, crossing himself and muttering prayers in Latin as he turns his vessel back toward the mainland. Behind you, the coast of Italy fades into morning fog, but ahead lies something far more sinister than any storm could conjure. That dark silhouette rising from the churning waters is Capri, and somewhere within its limestone cliffs and hidden grottos, the most powerful man in the world has built his own private kingdom of unspeakable horrors. The Emperor Tiberius, stepson of Augustus and ruler of an empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates, has not been seen in Rome for nearly a decade. Official proclamations speak of his devotion to governing from peaceful retreat, of wise deliberation away from the corrupt influences of the capital. But the servants who have returned from that island, the few who have been allowed to leave, tell stories that would make hardened gladiators weep. They speak of screams echoing from marble halls at midnight, of young bodies thrown from cliffs at dawn, of appetites so depraved that even the most debauched Roman nobles would recoil in horror. Before diving into these forgotten chronicles of imperial madness and human suffering, if you find yourself drawn to the darker truths hidden beneath the marble facades of history, consider supporting this exploration by hitting that notification bell. Your engagement helps uncover these buried stories that powerful forces would prefer remain silent. And please share in the comments where you are joining us from today. It amazes me that we can gather across continents and centuries to examine these shadows cast by absolute power, connected by our shared need to understand how far human nature can fall when freed from all restraint. The man who would become history's most notorious emperor began his reign with reluctant dignity and ended it as something barely recognizable as human. Tiberius Claudius Nero, born into the highest ranks of Roman nobility, had spent his youth as a competent general and dutiful administrator. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall and strongly built, with penetrating eyes and a commanding presence that seemed born for leadership. But power, absolute and unchecked, would transform this capable ruler into a monster whose very name would become synonymous with the depths of imperial depravity. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. After Augustus died in 14 AD, Tiberius found himself thrust into a role he had never truly wanted. The burden of governing 60 million souls across 3 continents would have challenged any man, but Tiberius carried additional weight that few understood. He had been forced to divorce his beloved first wife to marry Augustus's daughter Julia, a political arrangement that poisoned his personal life while securing his political future. Julia's subsequent exile for adultery, followed by the suspicious deaths of his potential heirs, left Tiberius increasingly isolated and paranoid. By 21 AD, the emperor's behavior had begun to concern even his closest advisors. Court historians, writing carefully to avoid treason charges, noted his growing reluctance to appear in public, his tendency towards sudden awe about his private entertainages, and disturbing rumorsments. The Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor's person, began to report strange requests for specific types of young slaves and unusual construction projects within the imperial palace. But it was the arrival of Lucius Aelius Sejanus that would push Tiberius toward the abyss that awaited on Capri. Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, was a man of extraordinary ambition, masked by perfect servility. Tall and athletic, with the kind of masculine beauty that turned heads in the Roman Forum, he understood exactly how to manipulate the aging emperor's loneliness and growing paranoia. Night after night, Sejanus would whisper in Tiberius's ear about plots against the throne, about senators who mocked the emperor behind closed doors, about the corruption festering in Rome that only distance and absolute control could cure. The island of Capri, rising like a natural fortress from the azure waters off the Bay of Naples, had long been a retreat for Rome's elite. Its dramatic cliffs and hidden caves provided perfect privacy for those wealthy enough to afford such isolation. But when Tiberius chose it as his permanent residence in 26 AD, he transformed this paradise into something far darker. The emperor's architects, working with unlimited resources and a mandate for absolute secrecy, began construction projects that defied both logic and decency. The main villa, perched on the island's highest point, commanded views across the entire bay. From its terraced gardens and marble colonnades, one could see the smoke rising from Mount Vesuvius and the sprawling city of Naples beyond. But the true purpose of this magnificent structure became clear only when examining its more unusual features. Hidden connect passages to every room, allowing for secret observation of guests and servants alike. Trapdoors opened onto sheer drops to the rocks below, and in the villa's deepest levels, chambers were constructed with no windows, no apparent purpose beyond containing whatever horrors the emperor's imagination might devise. The imperial household that accompanied Tiberius to Capri was itself a carefully selected collection of individuals chosen for their particular talents and absolute discretion. There were the usual complement of cooks, cleaners, and general servants, but among them moved others whose functions were far more sinister. Former gladiators served as private executioners. Physicians who had learned their craft in the empire's most notorious prisons brought their expertise in prolonging both life and suffering. And then there were the children, dozens of them, selected from across the empire for qualities that the surviving records describe only in the most euphemistic terms. The emperor's daily routine on Capri followed patterns that grew increasingly disconnected from normal human behavior. He would rise before dawn and spend hours in his private observatory, studying the stars and consulting with astrologers about omens and portents. These sessions often determined who among his household would face punishment that day, as Tiberius became convinced that the movements of celestial bodies revealed the treachery of those around him. Breakfast was a formal affair, attended by whatever guests or officials had been summoned to the island. But these meals were exercises in terror rather than hospitality. Visitors would find themselves subjected to bizarre tests of loyalty and endurance. Some were forced to drink wine until they collapsed, then questioned while incapacitated about their true feelings toward the emperor. Others were required to participate in elaborate theatrical performances that often concluded with real violence against designated victims. The emperor would watch these proceedings with the detached interest of a natural philosopher observing specimens, taking notes on human behavior under extreme duress. The afternoon hours brought activities that pushed the boundaries of human depravity even by Roman standards. In chambers designed specifically for the purpose, Tiberius would orchestrate scenarios that combined his growing sexual perversions with his absolute power over life and death. The details that survive in fragmentary historical accounts are so disturbing that many modern scholars have questioned their authenticity, unable to believe that even the most corrupt Roman emperor could have descended to such depths. Yet the archaeological evidence uncovered centuries later would prove these accounts terrifyingly accurate. Beneath the villa's marble floors, excavators would discover chambers with drainage systems specifically designed to wash away blood and other bodily fluids. Iron rings embedded in stone walls showed where chains had been anchored, and most disturbing of all, hidden compartments contained collections of small bones, carefully sorted and labelled in a manner that suggested systematic documentation of the emperor's activities. The servants who attended these afternoon sessions were bound by oaths more terrible than death. Those who survived later testified that Tiberius had developed an intricate system of psychological torture that began with seduction and ended in destruction. He would identify individuals among his household whose loyalty, beauty, or intelligence particularly appealed to him, then slowly corrupt them through a process that transformed victims into willing accomplices. The emperor understood that breaking a person's moral resistance was far more satisfying than simple physical domination. Young slaves brought to serve in the villa's upper chambers would initially experience what seemed like extraordinary privilege. They were dressed in fine silks, fed delicacies from across the empire, and treated with a kindness that seemed almost fatherly. But this benevolence was merely the first stage of a carefully orchestrated descent into horror. As days turned to weeks, these favoured servants would be introduced to increasingly disturbing activities, each presented as a special honour that demonstrated the emperor's trust. The island's isolation made resistance or escape virtually impossible. Capri's sheer cliffs dropped hundreds of feet into churning seas, while the emperor's personal fleet patrolled the surrounding waters, with orders to kill anyone attempting to leave without explicit permission. But even more effective than physical barriers was the psychological prison Tiberius constructed around his victims. Through a combination of rewards and punishments, he created an environment where survival depended on anticipating his desires, no matter how twisted they became. Former gladiators in the emperor's service later described how Tiberius would stage elaborate hunts using human prey. Servants accused of minor infractions would be released into the island's rugged interior with a head start of perhaps an hour. Then trained killers would pursue them through olive groves and rocky ravines, while the emperor watched from elevated platforms, placing bets on how long each victim would survive. The bodies were never recovered, instead left to feed the island's population of wild boars, creating an ecosystem of horror that contaminated every corner of Capri. The emperor's relationship with visiting dignitaries revealed another dimension of his madness. Senators, provincial governors, and foreign ambassadors who arrived expecting traditional Roman hospitality found themselves trapped in a nightmare of imperial caprice. Tiberius delighted in forcing these powerful men to witness or participate in acts that would destroy their reputations if word ever reached Rome. Some visitors were compelled to watch as their own servants were tortured for imaginary crimes. Others were required to perform degrading acts, while the emperor's scribes recorded every detail for future blackmail. But perhaps most disturbing was how Tiberius used the island's natural features as instruments of death. The famous Salto di Tiberio, a 1,000-foot cliff on Capri's northern coast, became synonymous with the emperor's preferred method of execution. Victims would be brought to the cliff's edge under various pretexts, then suddenly pushed into the void, while Tiberius observed their final moments through a specially constructed viewing platform. The emperor reportedly became fascinated by the different ways people fell, documenting whether they screamed, how their bodies moved through the air, and the sounds they made upon impact with the rocks below. The isolation of Capri allowed Tiberius to experiment with forms of cruelty that would have been impossible in Rome's more public environment. He established what can only be described as laboratories for human suffering, chambers where victims were subjected to systematic torture designed not to extract information, but simply to observe the limits of human endurance. Physicians in his employ developed techniques for prolonging agony while keeping subjects conscious, creating detailed records of their findings that read like manuals for demons. The emperor's paranoia grew to consume entire days as he became convinced that everyone around him was plotting his destruction. He would spend hours interrogating servants about overheard conversations, imagined glances, or suspicious behaviour that existed only in his increasingly fractured mind. These sessions often concluded with savage punishments for crimes that had never been committed, as Tiberius convinced himself that preventing treachery justified any level of preemptive violence. The transformation of Capri under Tiberius created ripple effects that extended far beyond the island's shores. Ships arriving from the mainland would sometimes carry screams on the wind, sounds that local fishermen learned to associate with the emperor's residence. The surrounding waters became a graveyard for those who displeased the imperial household. their bodies weighted with stones and dropped into depths where they would never be recovered. Even the island's natural beauty became corrupted, as gardens were redesigned to accommodate torture devices, and scenic overlooks were converted into execution platforms. As Tiberius's reign of terror continued, the boundary between reality and nightmare began to dissolve entirely on Capri. The emperor's grip on sanity loosened with each passing month, leading to increasingly bizarre and horrific experiments in human degradation that would make his island retreat a byword for depravity throughout the ancient world. Today, as tourists flock to Capri's azure shores and luxury hotels, few realize they are walking over the foundations of history's most horrific private kingdom. The marble terraces, where Tiberius orchestrated his reign of terror, now host wedding parties and wine tastings, while the cliffs that once echoed with the screams of his victims offer breathtaking sunset views to Instagram influencers. But beneath the postcard beauty, the stones remember. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover evidence of the emperor's madness, each discovery confirming what ancient historians dared only whisper. The drainage systems designed for washing away blood, the hidden chambers built for unspeakable purposes, the bone fragments sorted with scientific precision, all bear witness to 11 years of absolute power corrupted into absolute horror. Tiberius died in 37 AD, not on his island fortress, but on the mainland, possibly murdered by his own Praetorian Guard, who had finally seen enough. His legacy lived on, not in the monuments he built or the territories he conquered, but in the terrible proof that unchecked authority inevitably transforms even capable leaders into monsters. The island of Capri stands as an eternal warning that when power faces no limits, it creates its own hell on earth. The fishermen who refused to approach that dark shore 2 millennia ago understood something that echoes across the centuries. Some places absorb so much suffering that they never truly heal. And somewhere in the Mediterranean breeze that still whispers through Capri's ancient stones, you can almost hear the voices of those who learned too late that absolute power corrupts absolutely, leaving behind only shadows, bones, and the endless sound of waves washing against cliffs that have seen too much.